Welcome to the Cash Car Convert Podcast, Episode 14.
You're listening to the Cash Car Convert Podcast with James Kinson.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Cash Car Convert Podcast. My name is James Kinson and I am the Cash Car Convert. This is the podcast where cash cars are cool and auto debt is dangerous to your financial future. Before I get into the main topic of today's episode, I want to let all my listeners know I appreciate all of you. I appreciate those of you who've gone out and left iTunes reviews. I had 2 iTunes reviews come in and just a small bump in my listener base. And I went out and looked under the investing category in iTunes where the Cash Car Convert is listed, and I found that I was listed number 12 in investing, which put me on the same page as Dave Ramsey and a number of the shows on CNBC and NPR. So I was in some heady company. Now, it didn't take long for me to go back down into the 100s. I think I'm currently sitting at about 167, which I don't think is too bad for somebody who just launched back in December. But it was kind of nice to be up there in that number 12 slot. I appreciate all of you listeners. I appreciate all of you who've gone out and left iTunes reviews. And I just want to ask those of you who haven't done that yet to please take a moment and think about going out there and doing that. I know iTunes doesn't make it that easy to get out there and to leave a rating and review, but it means a lot to this podcast in terms of getting it viewed. You know, showing up on the first page for investing for that category. That had to pay major dividends in terms of allowing people to see the logo and get access to my podcast. Now on to the main portion of the episode here. In this episode of the Cash Car Convert Podcast, I'm going to cover 10 questions you should ask before you go to see a used car. So what I'm saying here is, once you've done your research and you've found the number of vehicles that you want to make calls on in AutoTrader or Craigslist or wherever you've done your search, then you should use the telephone, use email to qualify your seller and the car. And I think I'm going to use an old Yellow Pages quote from commercials years ago, and that is to let your fingers do the walking. So dial that telephone, save your gas money, and pre-screen as much as you can the vehicles that you're hoping to ultimately go out and look at. So I do also want to say, even though I said you can do this via email, I would really recommend that the questions I'm going to reference here, you probably really do want to go and use a telephone to have these conversations. And the reason for that is, and I'm going to mention it a number of times as I go through this, I think it's really, really important to listen to the tone, look for evasiveness, look for hesitation in the voice of the seller when you ask some of these questions. And so you just want to, really have your antennae up and be, hyper aware of the way they're answering and just, trust your instincts. That's something I'm going to tell you a lot through this. Trust your instincts and don't be afraid to walk away from something that you don't think is a good deal. So we'll cover that a bit more in detail at the end of this as well. So the 10 questions to qualify both a used car and a private seller. Number 1, the first question I like to ask is the seller, how long have you owned this car? And the reason I want to do that is because if the seller hasn't owned the car for a long period of time, there's typically one of 2 reasons. And the first one is the seller is either a dealer or a car flipper. And the deal with this is that both of these individuals are people who've purchased cars solely for with the intention to resell. And there's nothing wrong with this. I mean, I've even considered doing this some myself. But this is not the kind of seller you're really looking for. And the second reason that they might be, might not have owned the car very long, is that it could be somebody who just purchased the car and then they discovered that there was some kind of a problem with it. And so rather than keep it, they want to pass it on to somebody else. You don't want to be the person getting that vehicle, so move on. And the net here is that regardless of the reason, if the owner hasn't owned the car for at least a couple of years minimum, my recommendation is to keep looking. I don't see a reason to go rushing into a situation where you're putting yourself more at risk than you need to. And I think that's one of the messages you're going to hear me repeat over and over again is I want you to minimize the risk of you finding a bad vehicle. And so I'm a little overly cautious, and I'm going to, make these recommendations. You can follow as many of them as you feel fit to. If you think you can, ignore one or more of them, then that's okay. But just be aware that you're taking additional risk. And so it's going to be even more important to, have a car inspected by your mechanic and do some additional due diligence there. The second question I like to ask is, why are you selling this car? And I think this is a great test question for the seller. And the reason is I want to know if the seller has a valid reason for selling. And you might think that's a funny way to look at it, but what I'm really wanting to know is, does the seller, have a reason, like did they buy a new car, or do they just want a different type of car? Maybe they have a small compact car, and now they want to buy an SUV. Maybe they have a newborn on the way, or they've gotten some dogs, or something that has changed their situation. Such that they need a different type of vehicle. Again, a truck, an SUV. Maybe they're downsizing. Maybe they have a truck and they want to go to a more fuel-efficient vehicle. So any of those things I think are very legitimate reasons for selling. Some people will buy a new car and then sell. Again, I think that's a very legitimate reason. But what you're looking for here is more, as I mentioned before, you want to know, does the seller hesitate? Do they seem evasive about answering why they're selling the car? If they do, if you get any feeling of deception or hesitation, then I'm going to say, go to the next car on your list. Don't mess with this one any further. Number 3, has this car been in any accidents? Now, this information you can get from a car history report service like Carfax. And I think that's a really great service, and I would highly recommend that you either buy the Carfax yourself, or as in my interview with Chris Basso of Carfax, I believe that was episode 3. I'll have that linked up in the show notes. There's lots of information that can be found in a Carfax. So if you haven't listened to that episode, you really should. I learned a lot about what Carfax can do that I didn't know they could do. So I would encourage you to do that. But the reason for asking the question is there's a couple of reasons. Number 1, you want to see how the seller responds to the question. Again, are they evasive? Are they hesitant? If so, then there's probably some kind of a problem that they're hiding. Number 2, not all accidents will show up on a car history report. Some things so minor as parking lot accidents may not show up. And I'll just say, a very minor accident doesn't really stop me from going to take a look at a vehicle, as long as I know that either it's been repaired or that it is in fact very minor. And I mentioned in a previous episode that I've purchased vehicles before that do have some minor, parking lot type dents in them. Especially for when we're buying cars under $5,000, I'm a lot more interested in how it works mechanically. Obviously, I'd prefer to not have something that's embarrassing to drive, but at the end of the day, it's a tool to get me from point A to point B reliably, and that's really what I'm looking for here. The last thing I'll say on this particular question is that, if there is some type of dent or minor damage to it, you would take that into consideration when you're pricing out the vehicle. So, if you're looking on Edmunds or KBB, you would want to, say that the car was in, fair condition or something along those lines, or good condition as opposed to excellent, as a way of getting a better representative price from those tools. So you'd expect some kind of a price reduction for the car not quite being pristine. Number 4, has this car had any major issues with the motor or transmission? Now, the motor and transmission are 2 of a car's more expensive items to have repaired. So if a car has had a major issue with the motor or transmission, I personally view it in one of 2 ways. It can either be that the seller or even a previous owner didn't maintain the car and didn't take good care of it, and therefore it now has a problem. So they didn't change the oil, or they didn't change the transmission fluid, or something along those lines. It could also be that there was just some poor workmanship from the manufacturer that has left the engine or transmission with some kind of a defect that got past their quality control. Either way, I'm of the opinion that you probably will want to pass on a car that has had a major engine or transmission problem. I've taken some flyers on a couple of these kinds of things in the past, and most of the time they have come back to bite me. Now, I have had a major engine overhaul done on a car that I myself owned, And I subsequently drove that car for about another 5 years and put probably 10 more thousand miles on it. So it was a spare car. I didn't drive it a lot, but I did get some good use out of it. So I'm not saying that every time a car has an engine repair or a transmission repair, a major one, that it means there's something wrong with it. I'm just saying in this case, where you're moving from a car that you have a lot of debt on, and I'm assuming you also have other debt, credit card debt, etc., that you want as much margin in your life as you can. There are just too many cars out there for sale to take a risk on one that's had a major overhaul of some sort. So again, I would steer clear of that. The fifth question: do all the electrical switches and electrical components work? And I really think this is a really key question, and I'll tell you why. I think electrical issues, they are the kinds of problems that can really haunt a car. So, you have an electrical problem that people just can't quite nail down and can't find. And the problem with that is that, these mechanics, they're pretty well paid. So all the hours they spend trying to track down this elusive problem can be quite costly. And if you'll remember from my new car mistake episode of my podcast, it was an electrical issue in the motor that caused the starting problems that I had for the first 18 months that I owned that car. So elusive that all the time it was covered under warranty, the dealership was unable to find that problem. So electrical problems can be something you need to think about passing on just because of the nature of them. Now, if I do find a car that has an electrical issue, I'm going to ask the seller why it hasn't been repaired. And, as with every question that I've mentioned so far, you want to really listen to the way they answer. Is their answer plausible, or not? And if they haven't repaired this, this particular electrical issue, what else haven't they repaired on the car that maybe you can't see? What else is worn out and needs to be repaired? So I would really read the seller on this one. And I can tell you from having owned some cars that have had some of these issues I'm going to list here: intermittent light failures, electrical switch malfunctions, gauge errors. All of those things can be really pretty unsettling. I had a Saab that the interior dash lights worked on intermittently. I had a car that a Sterling, which was imported in the U.S. for just a little while, and the switches on that vehicle, the sunroof, for instance, it would work intermittently, and it was very frustrating. So it was the kind of thing that it can be very expensive to diagnose. So I would definitely try to stay away from any car that has an electrical problem, unless it's something that you feel very confident that you understand the source of it, and you feel confident your mechanic can deal with it, or it's something that when you take it to your mechanic, they can give you some guidance on it. But again, from my perspective, there's just too many cars out there. And again, once I find an owner hasn't taken care of a particular problem, I start questioning what else haven't they done. The next question is number 6. Does this car leak any fluids? And so I'm looking at a used car, and I want to know, what kind of fluids it's leaking, if any, because obviously that can be a big problem. You've got all kinds of seals and gaskets and so forth associated with a motor and a transmission, and replacing those can be very costly. For those of you who listened to the episode where my friend was going to trade in their Honda Accord due to the oil pan had a leak, and then they also found a leak in a transmission seal. So I know the transmission seal was $800, and I'm not sure exactly how much the oil pan was to repair the gasket on that one. I doubt it was nearly that much. But nonetheless, there's some expense associated with that. And also, you're running the risk that maybe they ran the vehicle while it was low on fluid. So if it's leaking, maybe they didn't replace it in time, and therefore it might have run low. Some of the fluids that could be leaking might be your oil, your brake fluid, your power steering fluid, your transmission fluid, and those are just a few that you might be aware of. And as I've said before, if the seller hasn't repaired this leak, what else hasn't he or she repaired? And I think that's a question you really have to look at when you're out looking at a vehicle. And in this case, you're just making the phone call. So even before you go out and look at it, you got to be thinking about this. What kind of care has the previous owner taken of this vehicle? Because that's what you're inheriting. So my recommendation is if you have some fluid leaks, move on. Number 7. I like to know what the condition of the tires are, and I like to know the brand if they're known. So I'll ask about exactly that. What is the condition of the tires, and what is the brand? And it's amazing to me how many people don't know the brand of tires on their vehicle. And I understand maybe if you bought a vehicle and you didn't put them on, or maybe you're just not a detail person. I don't know. But for me, when I go and buy the tires, I'm very intentional about the tires I buy, and therefore I know what brand they are, and I know why I put them on the vehicle in the first place. And one of the major things to think about here is that tires are a major expense item on a car, and they can range anywhere from $300 to $800 for a car, $1,000 up for trucks. So a tire, so if you find a car that has tires with too much wear, then not only can they be hazardous to you and others around you, but also there's the expense of having to replace those tires in a near term. So for that reason, you're looking for an answer that indicates that the tires are in good shape with plenty of tread. Preferably, they know what brand it is. And if it's a quality brand like Michelin or Goodyear, well, yeah, that's a plus, and you would kind of put that in the plus category. Poor tires, of course, are a red flag. They don't automatically disqualify a car for me. I think people, some people like to really run their tires kind of to the ragged edge. So that doesn't necessarily indicate that they didn't do other maintenance items on the vehicle. But it is something that you want to think about and be aware of, again, just because of the price point of replacing those and the expense of it. So what I would be looking for there is and the seller may have already priced it in, right? So you got to take that into consideration. But you need to know what it would cost you to replace those tires, and then you got to count in your own time and the hassle factor of having to go to a tire shop and have those tires replaced, and so there's some expense and your time, and both of those things are valuable. But if all other aspects of the vehicle are favorable, I wouldn't necessarily rule it out just because it needs tires. Number 8, are there any defects on the car that aren't evident in the photos? This question helps me find potential problems with a car that don't show up in the photos. And it may or may not be because the seller's trying to hide something. So I have gone out and looked at photos, and the car looks like it's immaculate on the outside. There's not a scratch on it. It's pristine. And I've gone and there's been some dent or some scratches on it or something. And again, they may not disqualify the vehicle, but they're the kind of thing I would like to know before I go and drive 25, 35, 50 miles to go look at a vehicle. I'd like to know that up front so I can make my determination as I'm weighing all the factors. Besides the paint, the other area that comes into play here is the interior. It's not uncommon for there to be small tears or some wear on the interior that may or may not show up well in photos. So just be aware when you're asking that those are kind of the areas: the paint in the exterior, and then the interior. The wear and tear on the seats in particular, maybe the steering wheel as well, are good areas to get some information on. And after you have all those answers, of course, then you want to determine whether you're still interested in the car after you hear whether there's any defects that didn't appear in the photos. Number 9, and this is one of my favorite questions: are there any problems you're aware of that I didn't think to ask about? I really like this question, and the reason is I've found that if you don't ask specifically about an issue, an owner typically won't bring it up. And what this question does is it gives honest people an opportunity to disclose the issues that they know about and the problems that they're aware of. And my experience says that most people, given this question, will in fact disclose information that they know. And some of them will actually disclose a lot of information, and a lot of it you'll think, oh, well, that's kind of minor and not really all that relevant. But some people are just so honest that they want to really make sure that you don't have a reason to think that they're being dishonest with you. And really, those are the kind of people you really want to do business with. And again, this is another one of those questions, as really all of them are. But I want to repeat this because it's just so important. It's so important for you to be looking to read the reaction of the seller in every one of these questions as you hear the feedback that you're getting from them. And so this is another one of those questions that really falls into that same category. So if you don't feel good about the answer they're getting, well, that's a red flag. And, again, I'm going to be moving on to another vehicle. Number 10, do you have maintenance and repair records for this vehicle? If the seller has a stack of receipts from years of maintenance and repairs, I'm going to tell you he or she will gladly share that information with you. And this will come across in their response too. I've mentioned, about reading their response. They will start to let you know all the great things that they've done to the vehicle, and you'll hear it in their voice. Many people will get excited as they talk about how well they've maintained their vehicle. And many who have all these records, they'll literally start bragging about all the records they've retained. And again, this is a very good sign, and this is something you're really looking for. Now, if the person doesn't have the records, you can still pursue the car, but you just have to know that you're buying blind. And that's one of my issues, and one of the reasons I don't like people who are buying under $5,000 buying from dealerships. You're buying blind, and you don't know the history of the car. And in that case, when you're buying from a dealership, you also don't get to inspect the owner and the property that they live in and all the other things that would give you some relevant feedback. So since you're buying this car blind, if there are no records, I'm going to recommend anyway that you take a car to a mechanic and have it inspected as part of your buying process. But it's even more important if you don't have the car's records to review. Again, you can go through the Carfax reports, and there will be a lot of information in there, and that's very valuable. But there's a lot more information out there to be had, and definitely take advantage of your mechanic. It may cost you $100 to have a car inspected, but by the time you get to that point, you will be having a really good feel for whether you're going to buy or not. So that $100 is really some good insurance to protect you from a major repair that could cost you $2,000 or $3,000. Again, I'm trying to help you get margin in your life. I'm trying to help you buy a car that'll be a blessing and not a curse. Now, I know these questions have saved me from making car buying mistakes in the past. My hope is that these 10 questions will give you more confidence about whether a specific used car is worth further inspection or not. Before you get in the car and drive across town, again, 20, 30, 40, 50 miles, whatever it might be, it's nice to be able to eliminate those that don't meet your criteria by using your telephone. The other thing I'm going to say here is good used cars come on the market every day. So it's wise to show patience and take your time in making your decision. My experience says that you likely won't regret a deal you didn't do, but you may well live to regret for a long time the wrong deal that you did do. And I can tell you from personal experience, I have lived that. There's deals that I haven't done, and for the most part, I never think twice about them. I just move on to the next deal and just say, okay, that one didn't work out for whatever reason, and I move on. But I've also made the wrong deal, and I've lived to regret it. It's cost me a lot in the pocketbook. Dave Ramsey calls that stupid tax when you do something dumb and you have to pay the piper. Well, I've paid more than my fair of stupid tax, and what I'm hoping here is that you folks can learn from my mistakes, take advantage of some of the scars that I have, and make some better buying decisions. And again, get a car that'll be a blessing to you and your family and not a curse. I'm going to wrap up this episode. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the Cash Car Convert podcast. Thank you, and I hope you have a blessed day. James Kinson, the Cash Car Convert, here with you to wrap this episode up. I hope you learned something that you can take away and use from these 10 questions, and you can do some work to eliminate some vehicles and save yourself some time and gas money by doing some screening over the telephone. So I hope you found this very beneficial. If you have questions about this episode, please go out to cashcarconvert.com/014. Again, cashcarconvert.com/014, and that's where you'll find all the show notes for this episode. That's it for the Cash Car Convert podcast, episode 14. Please remember, buy a cash car and kick auto debt to the curb.